welcome everyone for joining on this beautiful Saturday. I hope it's beautiful where you guys are. It certainly is in Portland, which is kind of rare for us. I just wanted to let you know that the event is being recorded and it will be shared on AAUC Facebook page as well as our website. For the attendees, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to ask, we have a Q&A box on the bottom of the Zoom window to submit questions and comments to the panelists, as I call them, to introduce their name, title, organization they represent, and any key information about communities they serve. Maybe something like statistical numbers on population in the US, and any information you would like other people to know. So first, I would like to introduce Christine Chen.
Good afternoon or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. I'm Christine Chen, Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote. We're based in Washington, D.C., but our model is to work with nonprofits in over 28 states to help them build their capacity and to implement best practices in increasing voter registration and engagement of the AAPI community, as well as in civic engagement.
Thank you, Christine. Next, we have Tavai Samuelu. Sorry if I mispronounced it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tavai Samuelu. I'm the Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as AAPI. We're a national organization that's based in LA. We work to advance social justice by engaging Pacific Islanders in culture-centered advocacy, leadership development, and research. Thank you.
Thanks, Tavai. Next, we have Oscar Zaki from, I believe, East Coast.
Hello, everybody. I'm Oscar Zaki, based in Washington, D.C., representing the Indonesian American Association. We are local here in Washington, D.C., but we have Indonesian community across the United States. Our goal is to promote Indonesians across the U.S. and also empowering through community development and business empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar, and welcome. Next, we have Brendan Flores.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brendan Flores, and I am the President and National Chairman of the National Federation of Filipino American Associations. NAFA is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and our vision is to really serve as the voice of the over 4 million Filipinos and Filipino Americans by uniting, engaging, and empowering diverse individuals and community organizations. We focus on 3 pillars, and that's leadership development, civic engagement, and national advocacy. We are the third largest Asian American subset in the country, with about 60% of our population on the West Coast, in particular the states of California, Hawaii, Texas, Nevada, and Washington.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Rajiv Singh.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rajiv Singh. I'm part of the National Leadership Council for the Hindu American Foundation. Very briefly, HAF is a nonprofit advocacy group, and it champions the issues of concerns for Hindus to institutions both locally as well as federally that are of concern to Hindus, especially defending civil and human rights. Today, I'm speaking on behalf of over 6 million Indians in the United States. At some point, I would like to also take the opportunity to explain to the participants the nuances of how those 6 million break up between Indians versus, let's say, Hindus in general, and why that is important. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, we have an amazing group of panelists. We were very intentional when we tried to form this group. We were aware that we couldn't possibly represent all the nationalities and ethnicities and various representatives from Asian American Pacific Islander group. A lot of times people assume Asian Americans are this one thing, but as those of us who are here know, we are made up of different languages, cultures, food, religion, we want to talk about some of the issues that are coming to us, for all of us as immigrant families, as folks who are not seen as white majority. And so if you have any comments that you want to make today, we just want to talk about the fact that many of the nonprofits that are participating and the representatives are from nonprofit organizations. So we want to keep this conversation nonpartisan and inclusive as much as possible. Okay. So we'll get started. First, as I mentioned just now, as Asian American Pacific Islanders, we are seen as perpetual immigrants and that we're not truly American. What is your organization and or community doing to educate other community members and the general public in the US about us, Asian Pacific Islanders, being American? And I would also like to ask if you could give some examples of how you advocate for our community and build political voice and power. So first, I would like to see if we can get Tavai from AAPI to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think you alluded to this a bit at the beginning, right, in your original remarks, that American is a very coded word, and that code is really often white, and that when people are seeking out this notion of being deemed American, it's actually this desire to be granted access to the rights, privileges, power that is given to those who are considered American, right? And so even, it's also important to acknowledge, like, not every Pacific Islander wants to be American. That Haunani K. Trask very famously, in a speech marking the centennial of the overthrow of Hawaii, exclaimed multiple times, "We are not American," right? That America happened without our consent or permission. And so when we talk about a lot of the education that AAPI does, not to all non-Pacific Islanders, right, to Asian American communities as well, is on who Pacific Islanders are and acknowledging that history of the difference between being immigrants versus refugees versus the colonized, those who America came to us before we even came to the shores of this country. So then in starting from that place, right, that it's not begging to be American or be seen as American, because quite frankly, even white people can't agree on the definition of American, and they invented that. And it is an invention. So in seeing that we start from this place of understanding that we're sort of doing cultural translation around American, and that what we're actually asking for is the rights and privileges deemed right, that American also has very little to do with citizenship, that what we're seeing in this country around these uprisings, that like even Black Americans are not granted or seen as American or given that access to humanity that others are. So I'm going to pause there.
That's a very interesting and good point, that some of AAPI folks don't want to be considered to be American and that they're colonized. That's a very interesting point. Is there another panelist who wants to add to what Tavai just said or have any comments?
Hey, Jenny, to Brenda.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Ladies first, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to also point out, also for the Asian community, the reality is also over 2/3 of this community continue to be first generation immigrants, right? And so with that, the whole concept of being American, I think to Vai's point in regards to it really is about having the same rights as others is really more the type of definition that we should really be focusing on, because as we are seeing, a lot of Americans don't have the same access to healthcare, don't have the access to a lot of things that's really being proven and demonstrated in the last 6 months of this year. But for AAPI Vote, what we do want to try to emphasize is that when you are here, and if we want to ensure that we all have the rights that we're supposed to have, that it also means we need to participate. And for AAPI Vote, it really is about increasing our civic participation, but it's also about making people understand that this is a tool to ensure that they have a voice. And this democracy is not perfect, but it's only a democracy if everyone participates. It's not a democracy when less than 50% of the population is not participating.
Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree with Christine, and I'd say too. First, let me say that before we can educate the general public, we also need to educate ourselves and believe that we have an immense power to really make a change. And we got to stop living in fear, right? And it's not about bragging, but numbers don't lie. Asian Americans continue to be the fastest growing population in the U.S. I think we all know we are projected to be the largest immigrant group, surpassing the Hispanics by 2055. Our average household income is over 20,000 greater than the national average. Our combined purchasing power is over $1 trillion. So in essence, Asian Americans continue to positively contribute to the nation's economy. So we need to know that.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. So talking about what just came up, how do we educate those folks who are our own community about who we are? I'm actually going to add to the point that just came up in the Q&A section. It said, what are the challenges that you have seen in bringing Asian Americans together, considering the fact that, maybe our mother countries don't have the greatest of relationships, right? And then all of us, as Tavai mentioned, may not fully understand experiences of other groups of AAPI. So how do we overcome it and work together to move forward, to build our power, political power, so we can all have access to healthcare, education, jobs, and all that? Is there a panelist who would like to maybe take on that answer to get started?
I would like to chime in, Jenny, on this one.
Go ahead.
So first and foremost, and I want to kind of tie the last question to this one as well. First and foremost, I think we have to recognize that we are a nation of immigrants. And I think that fact is not likely to change anytime soon. The reason that is important to acknowledge is because with immigrants come a lot of ties to the countries that they are coming from, to the cultures that they are representing, to the history they pride in. And even though, yes, we are Americans, we have to build a muscle in all of us, between and amongst all of us, to try and understand what that history is. So yes, it is true that all politics is local, but in this day and age, not perhaps all politics is local. There are issues happening around in the world that are near and dear to people, especially who are immigrants in this country. So I think that said, it is very important that as we strive to build a more respectful society, a more pluralistic society, first and foremost, we have to agree between all of us that if we notice any distortion happening about each other's cultures, each other's regions of the world, that we address it. It is not just an issue of Chinese Americans or Korean Americans or Filipino Americans. It is an issue of immigrant Americans. And if immigrants are the backbone, then we have to make sure that we respect all immigrants and their cultures in this country. We have to build coalitions against hatred. We have to call out things that make people come to this country. And refugee is, I'm so glad that Jenny brought up, Tavai brought up the idea of colonized versus refugees versus immigrants. Why do we have refugees in this country? Because there is a reign of terror and tyranny around in the world. Well, if we have those refugees in this country, then we have to empathize with them. We have to address issues of terror and tyranny and take them head on, right? We cannot shy away from any of these discussions. So now, specifically talking about Indian Americans. Indian Americans in this country come as immigrants to pursue economic freedom and opportunities. We have to be able to recognize that a lot of business is happening in Asia today. The geopolitical stability of Asia, its importance is only going to rise. So we have to be able to tie the interests of Indian Americans, especially in the economic sphere, with our American values here and influence public policy. And that includes respect and understanding of those cultures as well. And I think this is the avenue we ought to pursue in bringing more civic engagement, at least in the Indian American community, to create our next generation of leaders from our communities.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess if it's okay, Christine, I kind of want to pick on you a little bit since you do work with a lot of different groups. What do you think, based on what you can see, what we can do to bring the Asian American and Pacific Islanders together, considering our varied immigration history and perspective of living in the US?
Right. Well, first of all, I think it's also an understanding of those histories and the dynamics, whether it's that on the national level, but also on the local level, right? And, you know, when we approach our work, we also recognize that due to different politics and leaderships, you know, there are some barriers with that, but we actually need to go ahead and figure out when can we build coalitions around certain issues and certain values, right? And you may join a coalition for XYZ, but then your coalition for another issue may look a lot differently. And we need to recognize that and respect that. I think going back though, in terms of the elections and what's happening with 2020 is that for the overall community to ensure that we have a voice during this election and also post-election, because that's when we hold elected officials accountable, that we need to go ahead and have the entire community lean in and work on your own community to ensure that people are registering, that they're educating themselves, and they're ready to cast that vote. Because overall, when you compare the numbers compared to other communities of color, we're one of the lowest, we actually have one of the lowest voter registration rates in the country. And the young people in general are also have even lower participation rates, but that has been changing. We see that in the data since 2018. Young people, young voters actually tripled their participation for Asians. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders doubled their participation rate. And we're seeing this in 2020 where people are also getting involved with protests and getting more involved. And also the latest data, when you focus on young people, we're seeing that there's actually a lot more interest. So I have a lot of hope, but there's also the reality is we have 4 months and there is a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Christine and Rajiv. I think it is a very interesting point that the younger people are turning out more than they used to. And it's probably because of partly social media. As Christine mentioned, it's probably the fact that the issues that they're interested in are coming forward, right? When it comes to racial inequities in this country and institutional racism, I think it's energizing a lot of young voters and young people. I would like to actually ask Jiaoyan if you can share that slide. It's a quick data point that we have. We apologize, it's not as inclusive as it could be, but it was one that we could find. This is just one data point. I'm assuming that this probably hasn't changed very much, but since 2016 election, you can see that voter registration in general for our communities, and then the actual voting turnout, voter turnout is not very strong. So surprisingly, I'm Korean American, and between Korean American and Chinese Americans, the two Asian American groups who do have longer immigration history in the US and some of the other folks have a pretty low voter participation. So now I want to talk about the fact that, how do we get more immigrants, recent immigrants, Asian Americans, when they become naturalized citizens? How do we get them to register to vote and vote? How do we get them engaged? As Christine mentioned, this happens to be a very important year. It's a presidential election year. On top of that, it's a census year that only happens every 10 years. And we see over and over again a big lack of civic engagement in our community in general. So what can we do? Do you guys have any suggestions or lessons that you can share?
Jenny, perhaps I can start?
Yes, please.
So first of all, I have to give kudos that this infographic is amazing in its simplicity and the information it reveals. A very interesting point to note about Indians is that perhaps close to half of the Indian population, immigrant population in the United States, is not yet eligible to vote. And that is because Indians, unlike Chinese and Japanese Americans, and perhaps even Korean Americans, are very recent immigrants. They've been here, well, they've been here about 40 years, but majority of them have come here in the last 20 years. So this number that we see over there, 68%, imagine that just doubling or increasing in magnitude over the next 2 or 3 election cycles. So I think, first of all, I just wanted to shed light on that. The second thing to realize is that Indians, if are so high in number, then the question we have to ask ourselves is why do Indians not associate themselves with the label of Asian Americans? And this is actually quite true. If you ask an Indian, are you an Asian or not? In terms of the label Asia, they'll identify themselves from originating from Asia, but they do not identify themselves as readily as Asian Americans. And there's maybe a reason behind that. And the reason behind that is because they do not find the Asian community coming in support of the issues that are near and dear to the Indian community. And that is a gap that we have to bridge somehow. And when you put together coalitions like Asian American Unity kind of organizations, I think this is a great step forward in that direction. Now, as Brendan earlier said, if we have surpassed the Hispanics and as the largest minority in this country, I think that's what he said, then you can only imagine the voting bloc power of Asian Americans if you include Indian Americans there as well. So the question then to ask is, I do worry about potholes in my neighborhood. Yes, I do worry about quality of schools, but then there's events happening geopolitically around the world, halfway around the world. If we have to engage Indians, then we have to start addressing those issues because those impact our emotional health. Those impact how we do businesses around the world. And that is one way, in my mind, to significantly increase the Asian American voting power. And then comes the secondary question of, well, what are some of the other issues that are perhaps being either roadblocks or a noise in the assimilation of Indians or Indian immigrants in the United States? And what are the Japanese Americans, the Filipino Americans, the Vietnamese and other Asians doing about Indian issues? How much do they empathize with it? So those are questions I think it is about time that we seriously start talking about at some point.
I think that's a very good point. It's important for us to understand each other's and our communities and our experiences for sure. And I'd just like to ask Xiaoyan if you could get us out of the shared screen. Christine says that she has some data points that she can share on youth and other communities that are not covered as well. So Christine, if possible, if you could share it, that would be great. But if not, could you talk a little bit about
yeah, so I want to step back a little bit just to make sure that people understand the data that we're presenting to you. So, here we're looking at the 2018 elections. As you can see, this is in regards to, we're not talking about the entire Asian American Pacific Islander population. When we're talking about citizen voting age populations, those that can qualify. And then from those that qualified, that registered and voted, only 40% of Asian Americans and 43% of Pacific Islanders of those that could qualify actually took upon the opportunity to actually register and to go vote in 2018. So that's compared to 51 and 58% for the white and Black community. So as you can see, we have a lot more work to do, but we are on the right trajectory because in 2018, like I said, we've actually increased our participation rates with that. Let me go to the next one. I believe this is also another slide. I wanted to point out that there are differences, as we noted, in terms of by ethnicity. Unfortunately, with the current population survey, they don't break out Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, but in terms of generally, they are at the same levels in terms of registration as Asian Americans, at least for the 2018 elections. And then going back to, I noticed that there were questions in regards to the youth. I want to go ahead and jump over to that. We need to also recognize that the millennials and Gen Z is actually making a larger part of our population, right? So, 30% of AAPI citizen voting age population are millennials, 28.45% are actually Gen Z. And what does that actually mean? Well, we've also seen in the more recent surveys that of youth, this is actually from Circle, which comes out from Tufts University. They just released their data on their most recent survey about youth activism and political engagement. So particularly when asked about attended a march or demonstration, that has increased from 16% to 27%. And then when I digged in a little bit deeper to look at the Asian American participation, is actually at 28%, which is a lot higher than what I've seen in the past. So even in terms of other avenues for civic engagement, we're seeing an increase with that. For the youth, with the same survey, Asian youth are saying that environmental and climate change, racism, and healthcare are some of their top priorities. So this is going to be a little bit different from talking to the older generation. So that's something that we need to recognize, that there are differences in terms of generations and what we need to bring up and talk about when engaging young voters. Also, when we actually look at Asian youth, the outcome, they really believe that 88% believe that the outcomes of the 2020 elections will have a significant impact on their lives. But I also want to point out that when you look at the first chart here, the Asian youth, in terms of understanding whether or not their state has online voter registration or not, their awareness of that is actually a lot lower than, for instance, like Black youth. But they feel like there's more information, or they know where to find information about mail-in ballots. But like I said, for our community, it always goes back to the starting point of ensuring that more individuals get registered, because then once they're registered, then their turnout will be quite comparable.
Hey, Jenny, if I could just add, a couple of things for the Filipino American segment. I think we all realize the importance of education and outreach. You guys have seen on the slide, right? For the Filipino American community, certainly it's very apparent that we're underrepresented when it comes to civic participation, because in 2016, only 59% of eligible Filipino American voters were registered, and only 50% voted, right? And yet Filipino immigrants make up the second largest group among foreign-born eligible workers, or voters, I should say. So with that said, we have been active in a couple of key actions for NAFA. We have hosted civic leadership forums across the country in partnership with other organizations, including CLUSA, where we really featured prominent Filipino American elected officials, and they discussed different topics ranging from personal and professional development to civic engagement and local advocacy. Since 2002, NAFA's nonpartisan civic engagement program, we call it Phil-Am Vote. Really, it's aimed to unite, build, and increase political empowerment through our focus on voter registration, voter education, voter protection, and get out the vote with the help of, certainly Christine and her team. And I think, Anthony made mention of this. We really are focusing on student outreach because that's so crucial. So at NAFA, we really are reaching out to Filipino clubs and student organizations, local universities and colleges, to partner on outreach and voter registration, because we see the importance of young voters. In our community, 50% of our population are below the age of 35. So again, that validates what Christine just talked about.
Great. I actually want to see if I can get Oscar's perspective as well too, because the fact that a lot of people may not know this, but Indonesians having the largest number of Muslim community, right? Do you feel that experience, how does that influence your community in terms of relationship with other Asian Americans, as well as just civic engagement in general?
Sure, thanks. So in general, there are 5 levels of involvement that can be applied to civic engagement or to anything. First level can be dependency, and second level is stability, and then success, and then excellence, and then significance. So different communities may have different levels where they are right now. For example, the Indonesian community is one of the latest entries into the US, and we probably still, most of us are still in the dependency level, where depending on our education, our healthcare, our jobs, and everything, until we get out of that dependency level, we cannot think into doing things for other people. For example, I'm not implying to our community myself, but just in general. So as community leaders, we have to understand where our community is. And unless we can help them meet their need at where they are right now, then we either have to learn from other community, or help those who are at different level in the community to work together. For example, if most of our community are working, still 9 to 5, or even working, you know, different kind of job that they just have to work. There's a joke that I always say that a lot of groups have think tank, right? Different communities have think tank. People cannot think unless their tank is full. So, that's the reason. Until we meet their need, then we have to help them first. Then we can start moving on. Of course, in our community, there are examples of people who are successful, who making significance, but the impact is not that significant yet. Unlike the Chinese community, the Korean community, or the Indian community, you guys may have larger people at higher level. So that's my opinion. Thanks.
I just want to point out one of the questions that came up in our Q&A box.
Yes.
It's a person who's a Samoan who lives in the US. And can you answer why we add Pacific Islanders as AAPI as the same group?
Is that the question for me, or?
Yeah, Oscar, Christine, Tave, anybody who wants to kind of talk about that?
Sure. I think if you look at the geography, the Asia map spans from Indonesia, the border of Australia, all the way to Africa. I mean, not to Egypt, the border of Africa. So that's a wide range of geography. And the Pacific Islander is somewhere around the Pacific. That's probably the reason where, geographically they are included.
Yeah, I'm actually going to defer to Tavai because there's actually a lot of history that goes along with how these categories came about, okay?
This is an education for the panelists as well, too. So thank you for understanding. Yes, Tavai, would you be able to answer that question?
Sure. What I'm going to say, this is also the problematic nature of labels that we didn't create. The API here on the continent operates very differently from API in Hawaii, where many people, because Native Hawaiians are 69% mixed race, there are people who are literally API, right? I can appreciate the question. I saw it, right? Because it was somebody who's Samoan, ethnically Samoan, raised in New Zealand, and is now here in the US. And API is not a thing in New Zealand, right? Because that is not a category that you have to invent in New Zealand, where Pacific Islanders are considered statistically significant. 1. 2, at the federal level, they've actually already disaggregated API with OMB 15. So there are a lot of Pacific Islander elders, folks like Hardy Spoor, Uncle Victor Peng, Kaywin Young, June Boesi, PI elders who worked really hard to make sure that Pacific Islander became its own category, really 30 years of advocacy. And that when I see API, I actually mostly see it used by Asian American groups. That EPIC as a PI organization only says PI, specifically says PI, because we know that's who we mean. I think API is actually a pain point. That it's often a false promise that people use API, but they actually just mean Asian American. That as you saw on the slides, and thank you to Christine for the work that you did to make sure that you had NHPI data, but NHPI, even as a category, that represents here in the US over 20 different ethnicities, the vast majority of them Native Hawaiian. So there's this other piece where like, we didn't come up with Pacific Islander either. That if you go to some, like many folks actually work from this very ethnic specific space. And so API is actually not a very helpful label for Pacific Islanders. It's actually one we are often overshadowed. And if you think about the trajectory of the PI community, it's far more parallel to Indigenous folks and First Nation people here in the US. That we are also the ones who, they won't disaggregate us because we're seen as not big enough. But there are more PIs here than there are actually more Samoans here than in Samoa. So if we are not large enough here, we're actually not large enough anywhere. So I think it's important to think about that, to explore that. And I speak to in such an impassioned way because I think I'm a little bit, no, I know I'm a lot of bit frustrated with the number of times that I have to have these conversations with folks who say API, but they actually just mean Asian American. That a lot of it is this, I probably have that accountability conversation 3 to 4 times a week. So there's like the political organization of API, there's the misnomer of it as a label, and there's an understanding that actually for Pacific Islanders, that our interests, because we're not post-colonial, that many of our lands are still occupied, that it's far more aligned with Indigenous folks.
Thank you very much. I wasn't as aware of that. So, I mean, obviously I've learned something today as well too. And I think the point is that, you know, we're gathering like this so that we can learn more about each other, right? A lot of us kind of play in our own ethnic groups, like Filipino groups, Hindu groups, Indonesian groups. In my case, I do a lot more work with Korean Americans, and we do try to build coalitions so that we can support each other's work, since we know that at the end of the day, we're all in the same boat. We're all being marginalized, right? We're being shut out from a lot of programs, opportunities, and I guess we're just trying to learn from each other and support each other's work so that we can all have access to
Can I add something?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so your other question about being a Muslim in the US, probably not a lot of community, even Americans, know that Indonesia is the largest populated Muslim country in the world. And we have less representative here in the US. The Indonesian has the least representative of Muslims in the US. A lot of Muslims are coming from the Indo-Pac region, the Asian, Pakistani, the Arabs. So, but Indonesia is considered to be a quote-unquote moderate Muslim, and for us as Muslims, we also have to understand issues that other communities are facing. You know, faith issues, we probably have differences, but there are other issues that we all have common. For example, education, jobs, racism. Those are universal values that you can all tackle together, and we can work across communities. And that's part of the things that we do in the community to educate. For example, today we have a food distribution from the county. A lot of the volunteers are Muslim, but we are doing it at a church, and we're giving food away for everybody, not just Indonesian. We're giving food for American, for Hispanic, for other community as well. So that's something that we all have to learn, understanding the issues that are different for different communities. Thanks.
So just checking on the time, it's 11:46 a.m. there are a lot of questions that are coming up I wish we could get to, but it doesn't sound like we are able to get to all of them. I'm going to let the audience know that we're going to gather all these questions that are coming in, and if we're not able to answer them, we'll try to ping our panelists for you and see if we can have like a Q&A that's shared on our website. I think it's a great conversation. It's not something we can just do in one sitting. I do want to bring this question up, since this webinar is about civic engagement and building political power. It's great that we get to learn about one another. We're doing advocacy work. We're getting people to register to vote and vote, getting, you know, young people, millennials involved and educated. At the end of the day, you know, there's a popular saying that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu, right? So the point is we need to have more people who look like us, who think like us, who represent and know our concerns, to have decision-making powers in the Congress, you know, that so that they are representing us in legal forms as judges. They are serving in appointed positions that are making decisions about education to roads to healthcare services. So what are some ways that we can make sure that we have more AAPI elected and judges and prosecutors and more? How do we get to know about potential upcoming AAPI candidates so that we can support them? Is there somebody who wants to talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I'll go ahead and jump in. I will say that we have increased the number of APIs running for office up and down the ticket for the last 2 decades, right? But a lot of it is also because based on like the trends of the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities also becoming more civically engaged. So for those that are learning how to talk about the elections or about policies with their family and friends, learning how to organize for a particular campaign and participate in that, having that kind of exposure and learning about that process actually has encouraged a number of what are now elected officials, but back then they were a college student or they were a volunteer, but then they decided that they actually had enough confidence and information about how to run for office. So if we can also just start even on the basics, that's why I say it goes back to even making sure our own family and friends are registering and understanding how the issues are connected to the elections and to go vote and learning that process. You're going to go ahead and if you increase that, you're going to increase the number of individuals that are going to be interested in running for office. Also, I would say in the last 2 decades, we've also have seen a lot more infrastructure being created. There's more political PACs. Our sister organization, the Asian Pacific America Institute for Congressional Studies, does regular trainings because it's not only about running as an Asian American, because if you just run as an Asian American, you're not going to win. It's really about the values that you are that you believe in and how that actually translates into terms of public policy. And as organizations and individuals, we may not necessarily support every single Asian because we may disagree with them on certain public policy issues as well.
Yes, Penny, I would like to
go ahead.
So I think there's assets about the question you raise. As I probably mentioned earlier, that Indians do not as readily identify themselves as Asian Americans, right? So if the problem statement is that how do we get more Asian leaders and judges and elected officials, then it's, first of all, it could be a number. If Indians start to identify themselves as Asian Americans, we are solving that problem to that end, right? So that is point number one. The point number two is then if that is what the intent is, then what can we do to bring Indian Americans into the fold of Asian Americans? And for that, I mean, speaking a little bit about numbers, we have to be cognizant of the fact that there's over 6 million Indians in this country. Over half of those Indians are Hindus. There's 90% of Indian immigrants in this country who are recent immigrants. For most of them, India happens and continues to be the spiritual motherland and homeland. So what are those issues that are of importance for these people? Until and unless we develop an understanding of that landscape, we will not be able to have or build inroads for non-Indian Asian candidates and get support of Indian Americans. That is perhaps the reason why we Indians do not as much think in terms of Indian American candidates, but we think in terms of candidates who are aligned with the interests of Indians or Hindus, right? So the point I guess I'm trying to make is that there's two ways to look at this problem. One is we can look at this problem in terms of 2020 election, which is a short-term outlook. A longer-term outlook is what's the game plan for the next 15 years, next 20 years. If the game plan for the next 15 years, 20 years does not address issues of educating ourselves with our issues, building trust, then we'll keep asking ourselves this question over and over again. To be quite honest, I talk to a lot of Indian Americans in this country. We do not think in terms of whether we are voting for a Chinese American or a Japanese American or a Filipino American. What we think more in terms of is that does this person understand what are the issues of concern to us? Does this person understand where the interests of Indian Americans lie, right? And these are some of trust building measures and educational, self-educational measures that we have to take. Obviously, while we also maintain our focus on the question of what can we do to raise our candidate profile from our communities.
Thank you. That's a very good point. You know, we talk about the fact that Asian American population is growing in the US, and it has a lot to do with recent immigrants for sure. Brandon, I'm going to pick on you a little bit about this question, since you are representing a very large organization with a pretty, you said third largest population in the AAPI group. So what do you think, what are your thoughts about building political power and getting more people in positions to make decisions for us?
Yeah, I mean, even with two Filipino Americans currently serving in Congress, I mean, we're proud of them. We have, you know, Bobby Scott in Virginia and TJ Cox in California. We know that we still have a long way to go, because based on our population, over 4 million, for Congress to be fully representative, I mean, there should be at least 6 Filipino American members of Congress, and we're not close to that level. So what we have done, though, in our organization is we recently took initial action steps to really create a nonpartisan training program for Filipino Americans interested in running for office. So we created a run for office committee that consists of Filipino American elected and non-elected officials from local, state, and federal levels, as well as our NAFA board of governors and leaders, because we realize that there is a need. And a lot of it is just really, again, the education. And that's the reason why we're being very diligent with outreach. This is a very different year. But if it wasn't like this, then obviously you would have more civic leadership forums to really engage our young Filipino Americans. They might be inspired to want to run for office.
Yeah, no, I think that's inspiring the next set of people to be inspired to step up and get engaged and run. I think that's important. Tavai, do you have something that you want to add to this question?
Yeah, I think, so thank you to the other panelists, because I think they brought up a lot of really great points. In particular, so I want to note some contradictions that exist for Pacific Islanders when it comes to voting and political representation. So one is that there are 3 Pacific Islander identified US representatives. 2 of them don't have voting rights, right? The congresswoman from American Samoa and the congressperson from Guam. And then you have Tulsi Gabbard. So these are 3 Pacific Islanders, and only one of them can actually vote on issues at the legislative level. So what does that mean when we constantly send this message of like civic engagement, vote, 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 but the most visible Pacific Islanders actually don't have voting rights and have to heavily rely on relationships and coalition building in order to make sure that their voices are heard for the Pacific Islanders that they do represent. 2, that the places where we are most populated in Hawaii and California, we do not have PI elected officials at the state level or at these levels, right? That the 2 representatives, the 3 representatives, or the 2 senators from Hawaii are not PI. And then this other point where like California that has the 2nd largest PI population in the US has an API legislative caucus with 0 PI elected officials. So I think there's something to think about when our messaging flies in the face of what is the lived reality of our communities. Now, all this to say that, to Christine's point, right, that, and also to Rajiv's point, is that it's not enough to be Pacific Islander identified. That AAPI data will show a survey that states that the vast majority of Pacific Islanders skew progressive, but those representatives that I just named are not progressive candidates, right? So what does it mean if you're Pacific Islander if you're not out there voting to protect immigrant and refugee communities? What does it matter if you're Pacific Islander if you have decided that it's more important to militarize our lands than protect our climate, right? So I want to be clear that when I am asking Pacific Islanders to engage civically, I'm not leading from this place of like, there's a PI, so you have to vote for them. That we're talking about, hey, what are the values that drive the reasons that you want to affect the world? Because even if you don't have time for politics, politics definitely has time for you. That there's not a single avenue or area of our lives that is not impacted, and most frequently and most immediately, local and state politics. So I think that's the engagement level that I want us to think about, and also like to better understand why, when you're talking to Pacific Islanders about civic engagement, there can be such a disconnect. And also that when you're talking about democracies, right, like Tonga is the last monarchy in the South Pacific. What does a representative democracy and voting mean to somebody who comes from monarchy? So how are we talking about that translation, about that deeper understanding of how our values drive our voting and our ways to participate and deeply engage?
And
So Tawai, just so you know, I co-opted your statement on politics as time for you. That's brilliant.
Okay. I also just want to jump in regards to, because we're like, I see the questions like, how do we motivate the community? How do we get them to actually participate? Are the younger generation or the older generation participating more? I mean, first of all, it's actually the older generation, the first generation immigrants that traditionally have voted more, right? But we're seeing the change right now that we're hoping that that'll be reflected in the 2020 elections. But regardless of what community you're working with, or what if they're also of what economic status, it goes back to us having those one-on-one conversations. Right now, we're dealing with a pandemic that's probably not going to go away. So that means we're not going to be out there engaging in the community in a broad level. It's going to be about those one-on-one relationships that we need to go ahead as you're doing check-ins with your family and friends. You should not assume that they're ready to actually be registered and go vote. We've already seen the stats that most likely half of your family and friends are not registered and not planning on voting, right? But then because we're juggling so much to even just making sure that we have a livelihood, right? Then how can you translate, as it was talked about here, how do you find out where are the values, where are the issues that they're caring about right now, and translate it into how that could change with their vote, right? And so I just want to end, today just to remind all of you all have the power to make sure that your own family and friends, if we all can lean in and then expand that to your organizations, then we can actually help make sure that we actually are seen and heard during this election.
Thank you, Christine. You summarized very well of what we need to do to move forward. So thank you guys again for joining. I'm sorry, we have so much wonderful conversation, lessons learned from one another. I wish we had more time to discuss, but it's noon Pacific Standard Time, so time for us to end. I just wanted to mention that we are going to send out a survey. And so if there are questions that you want to ask the panelists, please let us know, and we'll try to reach out to folks to get the answers and comments for you. And I think this is a great beginning for us to get to learn about one another and the work that we do, right? We all have common goals, but maybe our strategies and our membership makeup is a little different. That changes how we work. But at the end of the day, I think from white America, they do see us as one block, whether we like it or not, right? they're not going to pick us apart and say, oh, are you from Samoa versus are you from Philippines? Or, you know, it's so unfortunately, the reality is when it comes to fighting for representation, we do want to have people who represent our values, but also know that that we are who would listen to us and to consider our interest and our community. I think that's important. So again, thank you everybody for joining.